Hey, Matthew here from fiberglassply.com. In this video, we're going to show you how we did a Psychedelic Resin Swirl Lam on a wing foil board. So this is a board that I built real quick last summer. We went out and did a little bit of wing foiling and decided that we wanted a board that was a little wider and floatier for one of the guys, and threw this thing together in like a week. So it hand shaped and it came out a little rough. Cutting 2-pound EPS that's 5 inches thick is pretty brutal, and the original blank wasn't wide enough. So we glued on some extra width at the rails, and that kind of came out a little ugly. So cosmetically, the thing's an ugly duckling, and I decided we would need a lamination that we could kind of hide that with. So we settled on doing a psychedelic, kind of a gray, different tones of gray and white and black psychedelic swirl lamb. So did a little bit of prep work there, got the top taped off and cleaned up a little bit of lip around the foil box just to blend that in. And now we're going to cut our tail patches for this. So we're going to do 3 layers in the tail, two tail patch layers, and then the layer that goes over everything. We're using 6-ounce S glass. This is an EPS blank, so we are using epoxy, which is fine because epoxy is a better resin to use for board building anyway. So we're getting our excess off of there. Running the Binford 1000 electric shears there. Those things are awesome. Super easy to use. Super easy to get nice straight lines or curved lines with. Fair lines is what I mean. And now we're putting on that piece of glass that'll go the whole length of the board. So we'll just get that cut and trimmed into place, and then we'll begin to mix up our resin. So what we're going to do, and I don't have a lot of video footage of it, but what we're going to do is we're going to mix up like 2 or 3 different shades of gray, some white, and a little bit of black. And then swirl those together. And yeah, before we do that, we want to make sure we remember to tape over the handhold. So I put a handle in the bottom of this, and we're just putting some tape over that so we don't get resin into it. We didn't tape the fin boxes over. You can jam some wadded up tape or something in there in case some resin gets in there. It won't get all the way to the bottom, but you really normally won't get a lot of resin into the fin boxes. So we have those 2-3 different shades of gray, we have some white, we have some black. We dump it all in the same bucket, and then we give it like a swirl, maybe a swirl and a half. We want to swirl that, but we don't want to mix it so it's blended, because otherwise it would just be some shade of gray. And once we've got that swirl real quickly, we're going to get that on the board. And depending on the pattern you put it down, you're going to get a different effect. So I'm kind of doing a little bit of curvy patterning here, trying to get that so it's not lineal and it's intermixed, kind of going to have a smoke look to it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to tip the board to one side and let that resin kind of slide over, and then tip it the other way and let it slide back, and then front to back. What happens is where the resin hits the fiberglass first, it stays that color. So where that first resin hits in the glass, that's where it stays. And so that's what's going to give us, that's part of what's going to give us that smoky effect. The other thing is, here in a minute, we'll start spreading out the resin so that we fill the spots that did not get resin on them when we dumped that resin on in the first place. So just letting it soak in, letting it soak through the glass, and also giving it an opportunity to run a little bit and get a little bit more of effect from that. So once we think we're good there, again, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the squeegee, and I'm going to go over that real carefully. And I'm not really pushing hard. I'm just trying to spread it out and let the resin soak in between in the areas that have not gotten resin on them yet. And the reason for that is if I push hard and work it all around, I'm going to muddy that look, and I don't want to muddy the look yet. So we're just, you can see I'm going pretty slow. I'm going with a light pressure, and I'm letting that resin soak in. There are some parts here that I've cut out, so we're going to skip pretty quick from this to lapping up the lamb. But basically the idea, get that resin spread out, let it soak in, and then do one pass where you're scraping a little bit more to get the excess off. So we've gone around, we've gotten that lap pasted up. What I'm doing here is we didn't work resin off the end and get that lap wet out, so I'm just taking a paintbrush and getting some resin on the lap. Not the optimum way to do it, but that's one way. If you didn't get it wet out and you need to, you can use a brush and get that resin on there. So we get that lap all up nice and tight, and check out that look. So pretty cool. You can see where we ran off the rail there and a little bit off the nose, and we get this just nice kind of complicated smoky looking pattern from that, and that really is going to hide. You can see where the fin boxes are and where the handle is, but that busy pattern is going to kind of hide the ugliness of that blank a little bit, and to some extent the ugliness of that shape job. Not excusing the ugly shape job, but this is the first time I did a board like this, and normally I would actually do these on the CNC machine anyway. And really hard to cut that 5-inch thick foam by hand. So we flipped it over, and now we're going to trim the lap. Basic process is I'll put some release cuts in the lap, and then I'll get in there and I'll peel up the tape to where the tape ends, and I'll take the razor blade nice and flat along the edge and get that trimmed down nice and tight as possible. Sometimes areas like this where the overlap is can give you a little bit of a headache, and you can see there like I dipped a little too far. Not a big deal, because we're going to do the same lamb over the top, and that's going to get hidden. What is a big deal is we want to get that that lap line as flat as possible and as little transition as possible, so we're not getting air bubbles or bumps there. So once we're done with that, I took that 40 grit block, went around and sanded off any bumps and sanded the lap line a little bit. And now we're putting on the deck glass. So on the deck, we're going to go with 2 layers of 6-ounce S glass. And same thing, we've actually taped off the bottom. I didn't show that, but we taped off the bottom because we're going to do a cut lap there as well. And doing that bottom cut lap can give you a really nice transition that if you prep it right, when you go to sand it, it's going to be a dream to sand. Super easy to work with, super easy to sand. And that's what you want. You want your preceding steps to build, to the next steps and make them as easy as possible. Nobody wants to sand more than they have to. And epoxy is quite a bit more difficult to sand than polyester. So here we are trimming up the lap, again with those Binford 1000 electric shears, best shears that money can buy. For electrics, the steel ones are great too. We actually really like the steel ones because if you got to cut something wet, you can wash the whole thing in the solvent. We mixed up the resin, and here we go, same thing here. We're going to kind of pour that around in abstract shapes. One thing here on the deck that was a real bummer is that you can see up there by the nose we didn't get a lot of resin, and this board will eventually get a deck pad, and the deck pad's going to cover up the coolest part of it, and up by the nose where it's exposed we really didn't get anything. But same idea, we get that resin on there, we tip it from side to side, and then we're going to come by with the squeegee, again lightly moving that, so we're just trying to get most of the excess resin off, but get a thick layer of resin in areas that have not yet been wet out, so those can wet out. With these psychedelic lambs, you do a lot less squeegee work. You don't work as long or as hard as you would on like a clear or just a straight up tint, because you don't want to muddy that graphic as much as possible. So when I like to get the deck all wet out, or the bottom, whatever side I'm working on, and then get resin on the laps. So usually the laps are the last thing I do. That's just kind of the way I do it. You can do it however you want. Some guys will get resin on there and start wetting the laps right away. It's just whatever you prefer and whatever works for you. So I'm going to go around here. I'm going to get these laps wet out and then paste it up. And once we've done that, we'll see what this board looks like on the deck. And it's really, I mean, it's kind of a bummer we're putting a deck pad on it. But it is what it is. So again, just kind of going around, you want to make sure there's no puddles. So you don't want too much resin. You want enough in there that everything's wet out. And then once I'm happy with how saturated out the deck is, I'll put the laps up. On putting the laps up, you want to make sure that there's no runs or drips. It just makes the next stage easier. So, and here is the deck of that board. And actually, I think that looks really freaking cool. I'm super bummed we're putting a deck pad over that. But that looks just really kind of cool and smoky in the middle. Different shades of gray and not so interesting up at the tip. But that's one of the things about, doing the swirl lambs is they all come out a little different. And, there is a certain amount of risk or rolling the dice to it that, you're going to get what you want. Again, we're going to come back now and trim that lap. In this case, I ended the lap line on the rail. And this is these are huge rails. These boards are gigantic. But the benefit to ending that on the rail is it actually does make blending that in a little easier. So that's one good argument, even on surfboards, for doing shorter laps, is because if you can end that on the rail curve, it allows you to get that blended in so that when you do your hot coat and go to sand, you've got a lot less fairing to do and don't have to work through that step where you go from your bottom or from your top lamb transition to the bottom lamb. So again, just getting that tape pulled back until I can get the tape either up vertical or taco it over, and then come in with the razor blade and lay that as flat as possible. Using some Rhino Locks 40 grit sandpaper to clean that up. And now we're going to do the hot coat. So hot coat or fill coat, depending on where you come from, it's the same thing. If you come from surfboard world, we tend to call it the hot coat because when they did it with polyester resin, you add more catalyst and kick it off really hot so it goes off fast. From the epoxy boat building world, they tend to call it fill coat because it's the coat of resin that fills the weave of the fiberglass. So my technique here is generally pour a bead of resin down the middle and then use the brush as a squeegee. So you can see how hard I'm pushing on that. The bristles are pushed out there and down. So I'm pushing pretty hard and work that bead of resin towards me and off the rail. We want to make sure we get enough resin that we work it off the rail and over the tape. You can go too thin, pretty hard to do, but it is possible. So again, come around to the other side and do the same thing. Work from the center towards you and get that resin coming off of the tape and over the rail. Now I'm going to do a cross hatch. Usually I do those at about a 45-degree angle. However, in this video, it looks like I'm almost perpendicular to the board. That one's a little more 45. So cross one way and I'm pushing hard. Cross the other way, pushing hard. And then a light tip off, and that's the tip off there. And this is sped up. I do not actually go that fast, but it doesn't take long to hot coat a board. 5 minutes or less, you should have a board hot coated. I will go around, especially on something with rails this big, I will go around and I will just double check that I've worked resin all the way off the edge of the board and across the tape, and do kind of the same thing where I use a cross stroke on the rail and then tip it off. As you did see there, I'm actually going pretty gentle on that cross stroke. I'm not really working that one hard, but just kind of double checking. I've got a nice film of resin coming down across that tape, and that looks good. What happens if you don't get it down across the tape is it actually will have a little ridge and like an arch, and it makes sanding that out more difficult, and you got to do a little bit more work. So there's the deck, hot coated, ready to go. Same thing on the bottom, and we're going to show you that too, just so you kind of get to see both sides being hot coated. So again, start it in the middle, work towards the rails. Here's that cross hatch. It, like I said, typically 45 degrees one way, 45 degrees the other way, using pressure. Especially on the bottom. This bottom has contours. So if you have concaves and things like that, you want to make sure you're getting that film really super thin. Otherwise, you'll get puddles in the bottom of your concaves. And that last stroke you saw there, just a nice tip off back and forth. And look at that. That thing that looks really good. I mean, in fact, we didn't end up sanding it. We just went and wrote it as is. Mostly because we wanted to write it that weekend and didn't want to get into the can of worms you open when you sand it. So looking good. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is we're going to route out the handholds, and we're going to route out the fin box openings. We also stuck a deck plug, or not a deck plug, but a leash plug on the deck of this. Since we found with wing foiling, if you fall and you're up on foil, that board can book off and take off on you. So it is nice to have a leash. It does get a little complicated because you've got a leash on your wrist for the wing and a leash on your ankle for the board. But it's a lot easier to keep that relatively close to you than all of a sudden being swimming with a wing attached to you after your board that is cruising away from you. So hey, thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions on laminating or any questions on wing foil boards or anything like that, feel free to get a hold of us. We appreciate it and we enjoy talking to customers, and have an awesome day. Thank you.